Ladies and gentlemen, the program begins now.
And a big shout out to Steve Markle, who puts those really wonderful films together. They are so provocative and are always a great way to start a conversation. So thank you, Steve. Contrary to what you heard from those people in the film, climate change is clearly a clear and present danger. All we have to do is look west to British Columbia, where they had unprecedented heat last summer and now are dealing with catastrophic floods. And who's responding? The military. Just one example of how climate change is, in fact, a national security question, because it impacts our readiness, it impacts global security, it is triggering massive humanitarian crises. We have a great panel here to discuss. Let me introduce them, starting at the end. General Onno Ecclesheim, he is Chief of the Defense Staff of the Netherlands Armed Forces. Sitting next to him is Kendra MacDonald, CEO of Canada's Ocean Supercluster. Next is General Rocky Mead, Chief of the Defense Staff of the Jamaican Defense Forces. And next to me is Admiral Carl Schultz, who is Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. Thank you all for being here today. General Meade, I want to start with you, because your nation is literally and figuratively at the middle of the storm. You are dealing with heat, you are dealing with flooding, you are dealing with hurricanes. For you, as a leader of the Jamaican Defense Forces, what is the greatest challenge?
Thank you very much, Jean. And I want to say thanks to Peter and the team for getting us back here physically, very critical forum. So I have no idea what's the cause, so I'm not going to join that debate, but we are certainly feeling the effects. So small island developing states, and particularly those in the Caribbean, face over 63% of the natural disasters that we've had, according to an IMF study in 2016. And the impact on us is obviously physical and infrastructural, but it's also economic. You can imagine how occurrences affect our tourism sector, for example, and to the extent that you may have, climate refugees, that can have an economic effect on us in terms of brain drain and also a security challenge if we have refugees coming in. And so we need to respond. The military's role is quite significant. What we have done in the region is to organize ourselves into 4 sectors, and the Jamaica Defense Force is responsible for the northwestern sector as a sub-regional lead. And what we have done to ensure that we can satisfy that capability is to have essentially a battalion on standby, 1 company at a time, so about 100 troops with mixed capabilities available to respond to situations. We have had to respond to floods even in Jamaica. And so even when we don't get a direct hit, for example, from a hurricane, we have had significant flooding, already 3 incidents this year. But we've also had to respond to our neighbors that have had impact from the hurricanes. But the real issue, when we looked at the abstract that was prepared, is the credibility of democracies. So if we can identify problems by strategic analysis, and the solutions, we have many smart people with brains who can figure out what the solutions are. The question is, why don't we contribute to the solutions? I think the problem is, though, that we have a lot of short-term necessary actions that we take because democracies depend on short-term outcomes. And so we don't make the great long-term decisions. And I'd like to, in closing, suggest that the more capable democracies, the larger democracies, need to consider whether they can afford for the smaller democracies to fail. And when you look at the impact of climate change on us, the small island developing states will show evidence of that failure before others.
General Eckenstein, I think there's a general perception that if any country in the world can deal with rising seas, it's the Netherlands. What, 1/4 of your country is below sea level? But is climate change, even for you, a major challenge?
Yes, it is. And Rocky and I discussed the technology that we use to keep the sea out. And we will probably, in the future, work together to see if we can help Jamaica with that technology and knowledge that we have in the Netherlands. It is a fight that we have done for decades, or for actually centuries, against the waters. But looking at the climate changes from now and the different effects that it has on our country, it is not only protecting us from the sea outside, it is also getting the floods and the streams and the water coming from Europe through our country to the seas. How do we cope with that? I have never seen in my entire life the devastation of the rivers that we have had in the last year. It is something for me and for us actually that shows that we are not yet ready for both challenges, keeping water out and dealing with the water that has to come through the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, actually, we also have our droughts. So we have a system to store water if needed, and we have a system to get rid of the water, which was helping us for the last decades. But it is not good anymore. So we have to deal with those 2 challenges at this moment.
Admiral Schultz, we heard General Meade talk about response. You are the responders in the United States. I watched you up close responding to one natural disaster after another. It is a tremendous expense. It's a tremendous wear and tear and stretch of your resources. As you look forward, how worried are you about the Coast Guard's capacity to keep up with this threat?
Yeah, Gene, I appreciate the question, and Peter, also appreciate being here, and my co-panelists here. You know, I just want on Anno's point, I think what we've watched is they've really informed their decision-making from thinking about this. I think we're there and we're really trying to amplify our game. For us, climate change, it affects what we do, when we do it, and where we do it. And to your point, you reflect on last year, 30 named storms in the Atlantic Basin, hurricane season. We turned the time back to 2017, Irma, Maria, Harvey. I was in Harvey on the ground in Houston. We pulled 11,000 people off a rooftop. So things are changing. I think for us, we are a law enforcement agency, a first responder. We're in the high latitude, so it's a changing Arctic. I'm sure you want to talk about that a little bit. Contingency operations. So we have to factor all that in, and we have to look at our own infrastructure. We're a disaggregated force, 55,000 strong across the country, Gene. So this factors into everything we do. I think we have to make the business case that a ready Coast Guard requires a certain level of resources, and that's a big part of my job. But I think it very much factors into our thinking, each and every day.
Kendra, explain what Ocean Supercluster is. What do you do?
Sure. So the Ocean Supercluster is one of 5 superclusters in Canada. We're part of the Innovation Supercluster Initiative. We were announced in 2018, and at a very high level, the job of the Supercluster program is to change Canada's reputation as an innovation nation. So what that means is we're really good at research. We have world-class research institutions, and we are not as good at commercializing that research. So our job is we are industry-led. We're almost $1 billion in investment across the country from the federal government that is to be matched by industry investments. So we are encouraging industry investment and de-risking it for them by giving them essentially 50-cent dollars. The Ocean Supercluster specifically, it's focused on growing the ocean economy. Canada has the longest coastline in the world, most of that in the Arctic. We have the fourth largest ocean territory, and the Ocean Supercluster is cross-sectoral. So Canada actually has strong companies in shipping and aquaculture and fisheries and bioresources and offshore resources and ocean technology and defense, and they all are working together on various solutions to be able to address some of the challenges of the ocean. Just very briefly, our projects tend to be focused on either digital solutions, so digitalizing the ocean economy, and more we are seeing emission reduction solutions as part of our portfolio.
I wanted to follow up on that, Kendra, and ask you how climate change fits into your portfolio of projects.
Yeah, so I think certainly for me, it's been very educational to realize how critical ocean is to the climate conversation, and maybe even listening over the last couple of days, that ocean doesn't get maybe as much attention. So the ocean economy is expected to double according to the OECD by 2030. So that's a $1.5 trillion US dollar growth. And so if we think about where we are with the ocean today, despite some of the information in the video, we've got sea level rise, we have temperature rise, we are seeing dead zones in the ocean, we've got huge amounts of pollution, we've got reduction in biodiversity, we've got coral bleaching, the list goes on and on. So let's think about what that looks like if we double that activity without thinking about how we're going to do that. And so there's been a lot of work done by the high-level panel on sustainable development of the blue economy, which the US is now a part, which is, I think, really exciting. And they have said that a healthier ocean will actually be a more productive ocean as well. So that's on the economic side. And then there's been work done and the conversation rising with the Ocean Frontier Institute here in Canada with a number of researchers raising the fact that the ocean actually absorbs more carbon than the rainforest. So we heard, or certainly I heard as a kid, it's all about the rainforest. But actually the ocean absorbs more carbon, and its ability to absorb carbon is decreasing. In certain parts of the ocean, we're actually seeing that the ocean's turning into a carbon emitter as opposed to a carbon absorption. From a Canadian perspective, the North Atlantic has the largest carbon sink in the world. And that is changing because as the Arctic melts, the temperatures are not as cold, and so that is affecting its ability to absorb carbon. And that is not well understood. And part of the discussion at COP26 last week was that most of the countries are not factoring in sufficiently what is happening in the ocean in the net zero calculations. And so that could mean that we do all these calculations around our journey to net zero, and they're incorrect because they assume a steady level of absorption in the ocean. And so what that conversation was about is us working, no one country is going to be able to solve that challenge or get that information. So how do we start to build a network of observatories like we have an International Space Station. By the way, we know more about space than we know about the ocean. So how do we work together as countries to be able to understand that better so that we can get the right data on our ocean to factor into the net zero conversation?
General Ecclesheim, do you want to chime in
Yeah,
there?
because it worries me a bit, because not only a bit, it is something that we don't know yet, what effect this has on the climate change and the effects that we are encountering towards the future. So any plan that we make will have to be adjusted. And if I look at the impact that climate change already has on our military forces, specifically on the way that we are used. We work with a single set of forces that is trained and equipped for the high level threats that we are talking about today, China, Russian Federation, etc., etc. But in the last years, we have seen that the armed forces are needed to get fires out, to get floods, to go against the floods, or to do humanitarian aid. And that reduces the use of the forces that we also need for the other threats.
So should a separate force be established then, military, and then something else that's a sort of natural disaster responder agency?
Well, we are first responders by nature. So the question is, it is something that we are discussing not very well in the Netherlands at this moment, but should be discussed. Is it the military that needs to be the first responder, or do we need civilian authorities to come up with other solutions than only the military? That is for me a question that we have to get answered in the Netherlands, because using highly trained, well-equipped forces in a way that we're doing now, that will end somewhere. So we have to find also another solution.
General Meade, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with the principle of it, but there's a school of thought that it is exactly the warfighting skill sets and ability to survive that militaries have that cause us to be able to respond to disaster situations. That's one thought. The other thing, though, is that, again, small island developing states don't have the luxury of creating several capable standby groups of men and women. And so what we have is a military. We have to assist with internal security. We have to assist with disasters. We do have civilian agencies with the responsibility for managing and organizing, but I don't think we have the ability and the luxury of creating another force like the military that can actually respond. So we're it.
Admiral Schultz, I know you want to weigh in on this. We have FEMA in addition.
Yeah, no, I would say, I think,
Coast Guard.
I think here domestically, you sort of have the Coast Guard in the middle space. So when we have a large-scale disaster, Secretary of Defense has to authorize Department of Defense assets to turn up. So basically, they do that on Defense Support of Civil Authorities, what we call DSCA. You know, the Coast Guard has standing authority. So if it's wet near the coastline, I mean, if it's inland, we can roll immediately under existing authorities. We can respond for multiple days. I think here, where we're a rich, a democracy with many capabilities, states, localities have capabilities. We have a National Guard. I think it fits that niche a little bit. I think I turn the hands of time back. Before 2016, we had almost a decade with no hurricanes. I had a workforce that I realized didn't get the reps and sets in to be ready. So in 2016, we had Hurricane Matthew, kind of touched up the eastern seaboard. It swamped out 95 in Lumberton, North Carolina. Who would have thunk? Many deaths there. But that was the first storm we had since like Andrew in 2005. So you could have a force, they could sit there, you got to keep a force trained, there's costs with that. So I think there's probably a hybrid model domestically. We fit that, state and local, DSCA authorities, National Guard. For us in the United States, I think we have it about right.
You mentioned, General, I believe that the facilities are impacted. Are you having to relocate or retrofit some of your military facilities because of the threat of climate change and because you have to preserve resiliency so you can respond?
No, I don't think. The way that we are equipped, we have to get adjusted to the way that we are equipping our forces, because they need to be ready for higher water levels or extreme temperatures. So I have to equip the forces at this moment with other equipment, and I have to train them under other circumstances that are normally are trained. So that has impact on the way that I use the forces, which is fine because, like we say here, they are the ones who are capable of doing this at this moment. But the impact is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the question will be, for my forces, are we keeping up with this pace, or do we have to find another solution? And that is not per se in the equipment, it is more in the way that we use them.
Naval Station Norfolk, which I believe is the largest military facility in the world, is expected to flood on an almost daily basis by the middle of this century. Major problem. General Meade, are you having to do some relocation of some of your facilities because of the threats?
Not so much relocation, but diversification. So what we've had to do is to regionalize our forces. So just a few years ago, most of our forces were concentrated in the capital city, Kingston. What we have now, a robust capability in the west. We are developing our base in the mountains of Newcastle. And so what we've done is to develop a number of additional bases. So wherever the challenge occurs, I will have troops available to respond. So it's more diversification and regionalization, rather than relocation at this time.
Admiral, are you having to move anything?
No, not specifically move, but when we recapitalize, we build into more resilient standards. We just awarded the contract in September for a facility in Key West that essentially was storm damaged over the years. We've exceeded its capacity. That'll have a washout capability in the first floor if floodwaters come through, because the Keys tend to have a propensity. It has backup electrical that can resist, then it has about 10 days of backup solar type power. So we're building resilient capabilities, and we haven't moved yet, but we're going to see Grand Isle. We just lost our station in Grand Isle and Ida. So that could be a location where does it make sense to go back there? Not obviously, there's political implications there and things we got to work with the delegation, but so far we haven't moved, but we're thinking as we build out replacement facilities, which don't come very frequently for us. We have a lot of backlog. So this is something that's on our mind every day.
I want to talk about the geopolitical. Oh, go ahead.
What I want more for my infrastructure is that it is energy neutral. We have extremely old infrastructure built in the 1940s or even before that, and we have never been able to rebuild it. So part of the program for our future is to make it energy neutral towards the future, because that is what we need. We have to work also on the other side. Now we are reacting, but we have to be proactive for what is happening on the climate at this moment.
Maybe just so 40% of the global population is within 100 kilometers of the coast.
Yes.
So this is just going to continue to increase. And we heard a presentation from Barack Obama a couple of years ago, and one of the things that he said was, this is happening. We've crossed certain tipping points. So you look at what's happening in the Arctic, for example. So we need to find solutions to try to mitigate the risk, but also recognize that we're going to see big changes in terms of population movement, in terms of infrastructure impacts, and they're only just beginning.
General Uckelsheim, I want to ask you about wargaming, modeling. Is the military doing enough of that to figure out what's coming down the pike in terms of real geopolitical challenges when it comes to climate change?
The answer is no. We wargame every day, almost, but I think that the impact of climate change on the threat levels that we see around us is not very much in a game or in a methodology. We cannot put it in there. What we see is that if it is the threat levels that are rising specifically in Africa and in the Middle East, where we see still the terrorism and the jihadism who are actually affected by the fact that...
Well, explain this relationship between climate change and terrorism, if you would.
It's not, for my opinion, it is not that hard. It is because they have a lack of resources, a lack of water, and the population is growing. So they will or move to a jihadi like Al-Shabaab support element that gives them the water and the and the means to stay alive, or they start moving down south, or they will do their terrorism attacks against Europe. It is still there. It is not gone. It is something that we are still very well aware of from Europe, and that we have to take that into account in how we look at the regions and we set our forces in.
General Meade, I'm wondering what you're seeing in the Caribbean region as a whole when it comes to climate change and this possible destabilization of governments. Are you seeing evidence of that?
Well, anything that can affect the ultimate security of a nation, be it food, energy, climate, can cause destabilization. And so most recently in the region, we had another earthquake in Haiti, and they had flood rains immediately afterwards. And so you start with a situation of a very fragile state, a very fragile economy, a very fragile democracy, very, very fragile infrastructure, and then you put disasters on top of that. And yeah, you're going to have challenges there with the survival of the state, as a credible state, and the citizens are going to look for alternatives. So that is a challenge that we have to treat with, yes.
Are you bracing for climate-caused migrations in the Caribbean?
Absolutely. So whenever, I gave Haiti as one example, but it's not the only one. I mean, most of our islands depend on tourism, and those depend on the beaches. And so what are we going to lose first? Likely to be our lovely beaches. But of course, persons want to survive, and they will seek out opportunities elsewhere. And so you will get migration. As I said in my initial comments, it's going to have a twofold effect, because you're going to have brain drain from those who are most capable of moving more quickly, the smarter persons, more capable persons, and then you're going to probably have an influx of less capable citizens from other nations that we have to absorb. So it will have a significant effect.
So, Admiral, some of that interdiction of migrants is going to fall on you, those that come by water.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so you've got response to natural disasters. You're going to have potentially more migration that you have to deal with. Fisheries, there are going to be some issues probably with certain species moving to different parts of the ocean. We're going to talk about the Arctic in just a minute. Can you do all this?
Well, short answer is, can we do it all? I think we are doing it all. Can we meet the nation's expectations? I think you need to recognize the changing landscape, and we need to be resourced to that. I will tell you, just being a partner here with Rocky and knowing Rocky for many years here in the Western Hemisphere, I look at 2020, Iota and Eta, Cat 4, Cat 5 storm across the Caribbean, strike the what we call the Northern Triangle countries, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador. Nicaragua's not actually, but it's in that region.
And we're seeing the results of
Well,
that.
you're seeing an area, so you got the dry corridor, which on the Pacific side of that Central American place is fairly rural, 12 million people there, almost 8 to 12 million touched by Iota and Eta in 2 weeks succession last year. It's an area that's been suffering from drought. You overlay the governance issues, the illicit narcotics that come out of Colombia that move through the land corridor. That is an area, when you roll up those four countries, you add Haiti to the mix, it's almost 12 million people here that are in acute food shortages right now. So you look at sort of the manifestation at the land border here at the United States, and there's a clear nexus there. So I think climate change and migration here in the Western Hemisphere are absolutely tied together.
And he's not alone. So we support each other specifically on these circumstances every day, actually.
I think we got a Dutch ship in the hemisphere that rolled in on Haiti. We were in Haiti. You look at Venezuela. We don't know the data on Venezuela, but how many Venezuelans have moved across the Colombian border? And there's a migration issue here in the hemisphere as well that's very palpable.
We are seeing migrants used as a political tool on the border of Belarus and Poland. If we are going to see these mass movements of people in future, even larger ones because of climate change, how concerned are you about the exploitation of those migratory movements by certain world powers?
Yeah, very concerned. You say Belarus, but we have seen it already in Libya or in other parts of North Africa. where criminal or non-state actors are working with them, sometimes even state actors. So to use this as a weapon is not only incidental like it is in Belarus, it will be more structural throughout the coming years. And that worries us, and I think it should worry us all, what's happening down there. So weaponizing these migrations, that is something that we probably would have not thought about 5 years ago, but now it's reality. So yes, I'm very much worried about it.
Admiral Schultz, you're the policeman, as it were, in the Arctic for the United States. Melting going on there, shipping lanes potentially opening up, great competition for resources in the Arctic. Do you, alone or with our allies, have the resources you need to truly keep a tab on what's happening in the Arctic?
Yeah, I'm going to rephrase that. I would say we are the lead federal agency in the maritime domain up there. I'd like to see the Arctic stay peaceful, environmentally sound, safe. So, that sort of has a security or a law enforcement connotation. I've sort of used the phrase over the tenure of my watch to say presence equals influence in the Arctic. So in terms of presence, we have very little presence. We have one medium icebreaker that just circumnavigated North America, partnered with our Canadian counterparts.
So what are the implications of that?
So the implications are, in the course of my Coast Guard career, just under 40 years, and when I commissioned in '83, we didn't talk about changing Arctic and weather. But now we've seen about a third of the ice extent change. So people say, well, if the ice is melting, why do you need icebreakers comment? Well, actually, there's less ice, but when the ice is breaking, it's not fast ice. It tends to be affected by the wind. The Arctic is the refrigerator for nations. So we need a presence up there. We see Russia is going to invest, and is investing heavily in the Arctic, militarizing the Arctic. There's going to be shipping lanes up there. There's more activity. So the Arctic is very much shaping the climate patterns, it's changing the migratory species and where fisheries occurs, and then it's going to change shipping, expeditionary cruising. So we're going to have more missions in the high latitudes like our Canadian counterparts and our other Arctic counterparts.
Yeah, you're going to need some allies like the Netherlands, right?
We have them, but we're going to need them, absolutely, rely on them more.
Talk about the Netherlands' interests in the Arctic and how important they are to you.
Yeah, the Arctic is not that far away from us. The region, Norway and specifically Sweden and the Baltics are for us the most important partners. And specifically what happens in the Arctic will have an effect on what happens in our part of Europe. It's even now already going on. The northern harbors of Russia will be more open throughout the coming period. So we will have more effect of their military capacity throughout the year instead of only short terms in the year.
Talk to me for a bit, if you would, about China and its moves in the Arctic. It is not geographically there, but it is exerting its presence, and it is really after those critical minerals that are so important to manufacture the technologies that will mitigate climate change. Worried? How worried?
Yeah, I think we discussed China already, I think, and we understand the push of China to get those minerals, or at least get their hands on the minerals in the Middle East or in Africa, or actually in any other part of the world. Does it worry me? Yes, it worries. It should worry us all. It makes us more dependent on what China is building, and I think we discussed that earlier. We need solar panels. We need green energy to cope with the climate change on the left side of the barrier. But the hands that China has on all those materials worries me for the future. Yeah, on the economical side, but also on the fact that they will have the capability not to give us this, or to give us the opportunity to make ourselves energy neutral throughout the future. Talking about energy neutral, it is something that I wonder, and specifically on the Coast Guard section, we have a lot of wind parks in our ocean, in our sea. And we have started up the discussion, who actually is going to protect those if they are far away from shore, not even specifically physically, But the fact that the energy runs through hubs that are vulnerable or for cyber attacks or on any other way, we have not found a solution for that. So I wonder if any other one has already a solution for it, but it is something that we are not yet very well protected against.
Kendra, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so maybe from a slightly different angle. So as I mentioned, Canada, the bulk of our coastline is actually in the Arctic, and so I had the opportunity to be up there, and we look at, it's a huge geography, sparsely populated, a young population, and what's happening up there, both in terms of with the permafrost, so they have buildings built on permafrost that is now risking melting for the first time, and what does that mean for very expensive infrastructure? They have always relied on sea ice and being able to build infrastructure on sea ice and travel. They're seeing migratory patterns change, so even being able to find food is changing. One of the projects that we have with the supercluster is actually to educate Indigenous youth on being able to measure ice so that it keeps them safe, because they are not seeing the same thickness as they saw before. And so how do we equip differently in terms of that population? And the other thing that they're seeing is, as we're seeing an increase in traffic, so whether that's cruise ship traffic or whether that's someone that's now decided they're going to take their sailboat, that is putting increased pressure on very small communities to be able to deal with that. And the responders are further away, and so that there is a huge burden in terms of figuring out what is the responsibility when people get themselves into trouble in the north, and how do we set ourselves up differently from an emergency response perspective.
I would love to take some audience questions. I have a feeling on this topic there will be a few, so please, right up here, I see one. Are the microphones available yet? Here we go.
Hi, Jude Terry from the Peace with Women Fellowship this year. It's probably not applicable to you, sir, from the United States, but probably to the others. We've been talking a lot about people as a capability. In order to deliver this activity, in order to counter climate change, to deal with the effects of climate change if we don't get after it at the source, you need your people to be able to go out and do those activities. In terms of recruiting, that's not what our motto is. For us in the UK, we are an expeditionary global force. Our guys didn't join to fill sandbags and to go after fires unless it's on the ship they're on and it's their home and they're protecting it. How do you intend to go about that if we don't want to create a separate force? And we might have some lessons we could learn from Jamaica, sir. So and genuinely, it is something we are really struggling with. What people join for is to go away and do things, whatever force they're in. That is a very different activity to what perhaps the United States Coast Guard sign up to, and I'd just be interested in your views.
Yeah.
General Meade?
Sure. It depends on the approach you take to the mission of the force. Certainly from my perspective, the military is there to defend and secure the safety of the citizens. And as far as I'm concerned, that may or may not mean facing a traditional threat. It means being prepared to treat with anything that may threaten the defense and security of our citizens. So in addition to the point I made before, that as a small state, we don't necessarily have the capacity to have several forces with different mandates. Even as a single military, I have a duty to defend my citizens from any threat, and the natural threats are just as real. In the same way, we have gotten into the cyber domain because that's an area that I have to be concerned about. So I'm taking an approach that I am and the force that I lead for the defense and security of Jamaica, and whatever the nature of the threat, I have to be prepared to treat with it until we are sufficiently developed to have additional resources. We just have to be able to treat with it. But I also made the point that a lot of the warfighting skill sets are important to deal with the natural threats as well. So I think it is a matter of what you explain to persons when they are being recruited. If you are primarily an expeditionary force that will no mandate to work in your own country, or if you have a mandate to defend and secure your citizens wherever and whatever the threat may be.
General?
Yeah, I agree with Rocky in this. And to be honest, if I look at the smiles of the female and the males that I send out, the men and the women that do these jobs, they really love to do it. It is actually a question of capacity and how much can you do throughout time. So I'm not worried about the fact that they will not come to us because they have to protect or our own population or actually the population within Europe. So I'm not really worried about it, no.
I would just, to our UK colleagues, so we had, I think some of your sailors on the Healy going through the Northwest Pass, the Arctic this summer. I think the Protector's coming to the hemisphere next year. So I think this is the allies and partners piece. You know, we had Canadians, we've had other nationalities. We don't have a lot of capacity collectively in the high latitudes. So where we can cross deck sailors, we're, you know, we've got Coast Guardsmen you wouldn't think with the UK Royal Navy. They had a shortage when they drew down in their engineering ranks. So we had 1.30 sailors over there. I think we're down to a dozen and a half now. But that's the kind of capacity building, cross-decking of talent we have to do to sort of keep us all in the game, and particularly in the Arctic as it increasingly grows in geostrategic importance, but there's not a lot of capacity. We've got to partner together. We've absolutely got to work up there together.
We have a question right here in front. If we can get a microphone down here.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael Arthur from Boeing, and we work actually with a supercluster, but it's not yours. And I'm fascinated to hear about the ocean supercluster. So I've got a question about the Arctic, but in three parts. I mean, first, throughout the Cold War, the Americans and the Russians worked well together on space, their common interests. Do you think that's feasible now with the Russians on the Arctic? Part two, if you did, what would you do about the Arctic? And is it just mitigation, or can you do some prevention? Part three, in Cambridge, UK, there's a leading scientist, David King, who talks about seeding cloud to get cloud over the Arctic to protect the snow. Is that for the birds, or is that serious? Thank you.
Who wants to grab that one?
I'll take a stab, Kendra, while you think about it. I would tell you on the third one about the snow-covered ice. So the snow, the ice reflect quite a bit more sunlight. So if you have open ocean, dark ocean absorbs much more energy. So it's a much more of an effect on global warming where there's blue water where there used to be ice. In terms of the Russian relationship, we have a very pragmatic relationship with the Russian. Our 7th District Command is in Juneau, Alaska. We patrol jointly the maritime boundary line. We ensure U.S. fishermen are not encroaching in Russian waters, Russian fishermen in U.S. waters. We do joint patrols. It's essential that we have a pragmatic relationship with Russia. I think it's important. In the Arctic, we offered U.S. government help when they had the permafrost collapse of a structure back in 2020. They declined that. You know, they are now chairing the Arctic Council. They're chairing the Arctic Coast Guard Forum for the next 2 years. They took the chairmanship from Iceland. I sit at my level in those sessions, and you know, we're trying to stay focused on the charter issues, which is environmental response in the Arctic. It's search and rescue cooperation. I think we absolutely can and should have a pragmatic relationship. You know, there's overtones of Russia wanting to kind of bring that to a security cooperation. When you look at the 8 Arctic nations, the Sweden Coast Guard and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, they don't do law enforcement. They don't do the military stuff. So by exception, you know, people will opt out. So we're trying to keep the dialogue within the frameworks existing, and I think a dialogue is good there. That said, you know, we had a Coast Guard cutter in the Black Sea recently, and you know, with Russian mounted forces, there are tensions too. So it's a knife edge we walk on, but we need to have a pragmatic, functional, open line of dialogue with Russia in high latitude Arctic issues. Absolutely.
We have another question over here. You? We're going to get to Beth in here.
Maybe while you're coming down, I mean, I think part of the discussion around the North Atlantic Observatory is just getting better information. There is so much of the ocean that we don't understand, and that hopefully having better information benefits everyone. So is this a place like with space where we can get to a place where we are working together? And I know NATO is trying to work on this as well. So we're essentially getting to almost a digital twin or a digital replica of the ocean at various levels for various people. Now that's a ways out, but that's an important journey, because with better information we can make better decisions and monitoring around illegal fishing, around carbon sink, around a number of the biodiversity, all the things that are facing the ocean that we just don't understand enough now to make the right decisions as nations.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think a lot has been mentioned about Arctic, you know. But after Antarctica and Arctic, the third highest reserve of ice is on the Tibetan Plateau. the difference is when the Arctic snow melts, it goes to the ocean. But when the Tibetan mountains or the snow melt, it forms rivers, right? Now, number one, the Tibetan plateau, it's warming up, and as you mentioned, permafrost, it's getting thawed, and the methane is getting released now. So if there is not much calculation is being done as far as carbon dioxide in the ocean, if methane is released, that's 30 times more dangerous than carbon dioxide, right? So the whole of Tibetan plateau, the snow is melting and permafrost is melting and the methane is getting released. So that's number one. Number two, because when the ocean melts, it forms rivers. Of the 10 major rivers of Asia, 7 largest rivers of Asia flow from Tibet. Yangtze, Mekong, Brahmaputra, Indus River, you name all of them. Now, the problem with China is that they have not signed the UN Convention of Water Sharing. So they're building a lot of dams and controlling rivers. So people downstream are affected, both on agriculture, fishery, and livelihood, right? Now, China has 19% of the world population, but only 12% of fresh water, which means 7%, more than 400 or 500 million Chinese are already facing water scarcity. So why they're building dams? Partly to divert rivers towards China and deprive, water people downstream. So we are looking at India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, So we are looking at 2 billion people deprived of fresh water. Now that's number two. Number three is because you build a lot of dams during war. If you release those water, you can destroy all the infrastructure, all the railways and roads of the other side of the army, then it's a threat as well. So both from permafrost point of view and river, water, and weaponizing dams. So these are the 3 challenges that's being posed in that part of the area. So if you could comment on that.
General, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, at least let's make sure that we will give them the technology to get a solution for if the water runs over the dams. But that's beside the threat that you are, I think, focusing on. The only way, there is no military solution for this. There is none. If we want to cope with the problems like this, we have to talk and we have to have diplomacy with China to cope with these issues. It is not. It is a problem. The permafrost is a problem, and that will give us a climate change that's probably more devastating than it is at this moment. But the dams and everything what happened there, that has to be there has to be another solution than only a military solution. But that's why we had the oceans. That was worrying me as well already. So the permafrost, which gives us the 6 times about that's what it is, extra dimension on the climate change. That is more worrisome. Plus, for Canada and for Siberia, where they use you use your airfields there, which are built on the permafrost, because it's not only a Canadian problem, it's also a Siberian and actually also in our northern parts of Europe problem. We have to find solutions there as well, because that is where the population is relying on their logistics. So we have to come up with other solutions there. So you're right. Partly we as military can adjust ourselves if the permafrost goes away, but we cannot cope with the other challenges that are coming from there.
Yeah, I think one piece on that, Gene, just is, I think we have to raise the general societal awareness of these issues.
Yeah.
I mean, the methane, the science, this is, if there's some smart people that understand it, that's one thing, but people writ large need to understand the geostrategic importance of the climate change issue. I think it's easy to say China's focused on the water issue and the scarcity for their people, or is it potentially a coercive capability to use for malintents? So I think it's a conversation about greater awareness about these environmental climatological issues that really shape. I talk about national security and economic security, prosperity being on the same side of a coin, but really they're sort of on the end of a cylinder now, and there's climate change resilience in there. It's kind of a three-dimensional thing now. And I think we have to elevate the knowledge level of societies writ large on these climate issues, so we understand, when the actions, the words and deeds, as Admiral Aquilina talked about earlier, sort of that they comport with each other here a little bit.
One more question right here. Yep.
Thank you, Madam. My name is Jürgen Hart. I'm member of Parliament in Germany. And the last pictures in the film we saw, I think they were from Germany, from the terrible flood we had in July, mid of July. And 185 people died. And the body of one victim was found 2 weeks ago in the Netherlands, in the delta of the River Rhine. And that shows how terrible it was. In Germany, we decided 4 decades ago to build up a civilian organized helping organization between the fire brigades on local level and the military on federal level. We call it Technisches Hilfswerk, a technical support organization, and tens of thousands of German civilians, citizens are working on a voluntary basis, week by week, training for this organization. And I think this is that's helped us a lot to solve the problems in July, and maybe can also be a model for other countries in between the local fire brigade and police and the military, because we have the experience that military equipment is not 100% fitting to that what you need in such a disaster. Tanks are maybe too heavy to cross small streets and so on. And only pioneers, you don't have so many pioneers, troops that you can use that. Tens of thousands of Germans are serving in this Technische Hilfswerk, and it's paid by the federal level and linked to the Interior, Ministry of Interior. Thank you very much.
Possible model?
Yeah, it is a possible model, and it is and you use it regional. I think you have not spread it out over whole Germany at this moment.
Yeah, we have it spread all over Germany.
Okay.
We have hundreds of organizations, and Germany is also supporting other countries in the world in case of earthquakes or so with this Technische Hilfswerk, because it has to work on the basis of the decision of the federal government, because it's linked to the home Ministry of Interior.
Yeah, so it sounds like a very good model. We have regionalized our security agencies in the Netherlands who can react fast on these circumstances. And another part that we would like to introduce in the Netherlands as well is that the brigades that are spread out over the Netherlands, we tend to coordinate them centralized from The Hague. So actually I want to decentralize those and connect them with the security agencies that we have in the regions, which will speed up the process. And this could be a model that could be in between there as well. So, good idea.
The fire brigade, the cars are blue and not red.
Go ahead with your question. There you go.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Jennifer de Porter from the Netherlands. I'm one of this year's fellows. I would like to ask you, what are we going to do ourselves? Because if you look at, for example, United States Armed Forces, if they were a country, they would be the 45th most pollutive nation in the world. You just touched upon it very briefly. You said we need to have a different infrastructure. But we just bought the new planes. They don't fly on biopetrol. Most of our operational vehicles drive on diesel. Just staying ready to fight a new war means we are contributing a lot to pollution. So how are we going to change that without diminishing the operational readiness of the armed forces?
Yeah. Can I take a stab at that? I would say for the Coast Guard, we're in the Department of Homeland Security, 250,000 person department. We're the majority landholder, real property owner. So we have about 92% of the energy projects. We are looking inside our lifeline. We did a project here down in Connecticut along the eastern seaboard here at our academy with energy savings. We further reduced our energy consumption 43%, our water consumption 15%. We've got a project in the West Coast, about a $48 million investment at our training center in Petaluma, where we're going to bring, that's very in proximate location to where all the wildfires occur. So we are bringing in land-based solar, the battery storage, 10 days of self-sufficient, last mile resiliency, sufficiency. We have a regulatory role, so we are working the Coast Guard, the Common Coast Guard is the lead for the United States at IMO, the International Maritime Organization. So we're driving to the 52% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030. So we're working the regulatory piece. We're looking to electrify vehicles in the next decade. Our engines on our new cutters are lower emissions than yesteryear. I mean, it's work in progress, but I would tell you, I think we are looking inside as our own, as polluters, and how do we better our processes. We look at it as a regulatory agency. We look at every ship that calls the United States ports. Are they complying with our environmental laws, our emissions control areas? We had some of the highest standards. Now that's a global standard, but California was leading on that. We don't like the patchwork. We'd like one national standard, but we're absolutely, I think, in that swim lane on those issues.
General Meade, are you also trying to reduce your carbon footprint?
Conceptually, but of course you can imagine we have very limited resources. We're still trying to get some capabilities that we don't have. But the point that we have to recognize is that those of us who are more capable really need to be prepared to assist those that are less capable. So to the extent that, the smaller developing nations support a policy perspective that will see, democracies thriving, then, as I hinted before, those who can assist. So we have no R&D capability. But once there's a technology available and, it can be made available to us. Certainly, as I said, conceptually, we want to move in that direction, but we're going to be a bit behind simply because of availability of resources.
We're close to being out of time, and Kendra, I'd like for you to talk a bit about public-private partnership and whether you think that's essential to drive the kind of innovation that will help these other panelists and others in the audience become more energy efficient and address climate change effectively.
So absolutely, we are seeing sort of a huge change in terms of private investment and philanthropic investment. Investors are having influence, obviously, in terms of behavior of fossil fuel companies, for example. And so as I'm listening to the discussion, and I think it was mentioned yesterday, government of Canada has a huge influence can have a huge influence with their procurement practices on behavior in terms of the types of things they look for in the solutions, they run innovation challenges in terms of looking for certain solutions. And so what we've seen with the supercluster is that we are incenting a certain behavior. We're getting sectors to work together in a way that they've never worked together before. We're getting them to move more quickly to technological solutions. And we're also seeing them being more willing to make bets on things like we have a project in Alberta that's a transitionary fuel project. So nanotechnology, reducing water and diesel, can work right now in terms of reducing emissions in marine transportation, for example. And so we need to continue to be innovative in how we approach these problems, and we've got the Royal Canadian Navy also playing a role in being able to help test these technologies. So the more we can work together, the more that we can reduce duplication, the more that we can build off each other, the faster that we will get to some really impactful solutions.
As we wrap up, I would like to ask the military members of the panel to respond to the question, in the pantheon of threats that you are facing, where does climate change rank? General, why don't I start with you?
It's not even the longer, you could answer that with it's a long-term problem or a threat, but for me climate change is one of our biggest problems because it sets so many circumstances where threats are coming from. So for me it is the number one threat that we are facing.
Would you agree, Admiral Schultz?
I would say, I'd say if it's a room, it's like the wallpaper in the room. I think everything in the room is influenced by the climate issue. We have to I started with saying it affects what we're doing, where we're doing it, when we're doing it. So I think it's out there and we need to factor it into our decision making. A little bit like our Dutch colleagues have done very masterfully. I think we need to bring it forward as we make decisions on facilities, on operations, on partnerships, relationships.
General Meade, last word to you.
I think if we take the right approach, if we consider that we need to look at the long-term sustainability of what we're doing, in Jamaica, what's immediately threatening us is internal homicides between gangs, and that's a reality we face every day. And we have to treat with that, but we need to always take a long-term sustainability view, and if that perspective is taken, then something like the impact of climate change on the entire country would have to take some priority. But each day I wake up, I am looking at the immediate internal security situation, but keeping an eye on the long-term outcomes.
Fair enough. General Meade, thank you so much. Also, Admiral Schultz, General Eichelscheim, and also Kendra MacDonald. And please, all of you stay seated for our next panel. It's coming right up.